Everybody, it's Tim, the Beast of the Phantom History House, and we are doing another great conversation about a book that I loved, which is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And wow, you guys, when we did our last discussion about The Haunting of Hill House, I was like, what should I read next? And you guys said Rebecca, and wow, I'm so grateful. So anyway, with us today, Douglas Ford's here. Douglas, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Christina Persaud's here. Christina, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for being back for another conversation. And Elaine Pascale's with us. Elaine, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So you guys were here for the last conversation. So rather than go around and introduce ourselves, everybody go watch the conversation we had about The Haunting of Hill House, which was really cool. And I'm going to say at the beginning here, spoiler alert, we are going to talk about this as if you know the story, as if you've read the book or at least seen the movie. Doug, to your suggestion, we did get the movie and watch it, and that was amazing as well.
The
So
Hitchcock film, right?
there's a whole lot to talk about. So I guess the first thing that struck me was I loved this book so much. I had such a roller coaster ride adventure reading it, all the twists and turns. I can't imagine how nobody said to me before now, "Hey Tim, you should read." Like, how did this happen? Do you guys have any theories about how it is? I mean, I read Dickens, I read a lot of classic novels. How did I miss this one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe when the film there's two film versions of it. A Netflix film came out fairly recently. I don't know if that one was very well received. I noticed in the bookstore that there was a reissue of Rebecca with promoting the film, but perhaps the novel hasn't gotten as much attention recently because that film maybe was not as successful as Hitchcock's film, which is a terrific adaptation. I kind of like Wheatley's version too, but perhaps that has something to do with how it's not necessarily taking a prominent place in popular culture right now. I don't know. Does anybody else have any theories?
Well,
I'm wondering if maybe it's too, I don't know, like psychological, old school gothic, maybe that people think they might not be into it. I know a lot of people, I'll recommend Gothic literature. I'll recommend like The Monk, like some really old ones. And people are like, oh my God, that was so amazing. And they don't realize that they think, oh, it's going to be old and boring. They don't realize that they're attracted to some of those tropes that we see in Rebecca, like the creepy housekeeper and the village idiot who knows exactly what's going on, and she's the damsel in the castle, and they don't realize that like they really do enjoy those things. They sort of in their head it's like, well, that's kind of outdated.
I think another thing too, it could be maybe there's a misconception that it's more romance than it is horror. Because just, the name Rebecca and what it conveys, and it's very I thought that when I saw the trailer for the new Netflix movie, it leaned a little heavily into the romance of the story, whereas Hitchcock's I felt was personally, I find the Hitchcock film to be a better adaptation to me. So I don't know. Maybe that's what it is.
well, I kind of wondered if it's kind of like seen as a chick book. I mean, that's a horrible thing. You know what I mean? Like, I wondered if it's like a girl's book because it's about this woman. But anyway, I did not read it that way. Like, I associated with her the whole way through. So, all right. So this is the other thing I want to say at the beginning is, to me, what was so brilliant, now that I've thought back on it a lot, right? Like it's been a little while since I read it. I watched the movie. I thought back on the whole story, and then I want you guys to talk more than me. But what was so brilliant was the setup. The setup was just exactly right because we know exactly who the narrator is, right? Who, interestingly, we don't know her name, right? The second
I was
Mrs.
going to say, we don't know her name.
Mhm.
This is De Winter. But anyway, so we don't know her name, but like we know exactly who she is at the beginning. She's so, she's this girl that she's not worldly. She's with this horribly overbearing woman. She's embarrassed and put down upon. And so like that, I identified with her and the way that we hear her thoughts throughout, like, oh, I bet he's thinking this about me. And, oh gosh, I'm so embarrassed that I don't know what I'm doing. And like we hear her thoughts. We are part of her thoughts. That to me was really effective. And then we get to know him right away as, oh, he's lost his beautiful wife and he's very sort of brooding and he has these flashes of anger. And so like, to me, by the time we got to home, right? Like after all of that, when we finally get there, Mandalay, or however you say, how do you guys say it?
Mandalay, right?
Yeah, okay. Because I read it differently, but then when I saw the movie, I was like, oh, I guess I'm going to say it differently. I don't know why. But anyway, once we get there, like I felt like the setup was perfect because I knew who they both were. I was really identifying with her setup. And I just thought, oh, like, I was so uncomfortable because everybody assumes she knows everything and she knows nothing. For example, so do you guys want to speak to that at all? Like, I just thought that was brilliant how she got us to that place where then all the stuff that happened made sense because she had set it up so brilliantly. Elaine, you're nodding. You want to go first?
Well, I mean, I'm agreeing with everything that you're saying. I kind of read it differently now, I think, than when I first read it, 20 years ago or something. Whereas when I first read it, like you, I really identified with the narrator. I'm like, oh my God, that'd be me. I'd be like breaking things in the house and like tripping and like not knowing what fork to use. Like I was so secondhand embarrassment for her because I was just cringing, like that's me. Yep. But now I read it very differently in that I think it's brilliant that she has no name because she's just this malleable, moldable. She has no agency. She's no identity. And that's what Maxim likes about her, that he can just bring her in and she feels like the dog. She feels like Jasper. Like he's always like, good girl to her. I mean, it's so toxic. And then Rebecca is presented as this selfish. Well, first, the fascinating thing is Rebecca's the ghost in the ghost story, but we never see a corporal ghost. It's beautiful. But Rebecca's presented as this selfish, nasty woman. But now I kind of read it with this sort of like queer lens where, well, first of all, Danny, Mrs. Danvers, is in love with Rebecca, right? And they call her Danny. Like there's something going on there. And we're told that Rebecca and Maxim's marriage is basically a sexless one. Like he's either asexual or demisexual or something. So she has sexual needs and she goes to London and she does what she does as long as it's discreet. But she's not being very discreet, right? And then what he likes about new Mrs. De Winter is she wants none of that. Like she's fine in this sexless marriage with him. We think their marriage isn't even consummated till he confesses. And now she's finally like pulled into his world and she's like an accomplice with him. So now he can be intimate with her. There's these. So now I read this and I think, was Rebecca really a bitch? Or was she just someone who had needs that weren't being fulfilled? And she and the husband had this arrangement, but he just got unhappy because she wasn't really holding up her end of the bargain in terms of discretion. He wanted her to go have her fun, but be super, super quiet. And she wasn't. So I don't know how horrible I think she is anymore.
I thought though that, and I don't know, maybe I misread it, but I thought that early on in their marriage, Rebecca and Maxim, I thought that she, like, really soon after the marriage, she kind of like took off the mask and was like, this is who I am. And he was just like, oh no, you're horrible. But crap, I'm married to you and I need a safe face. So let's do this. We'll have like this marriage on paper or whatever, but it's not really, So I wonder if that's why he never grew close to her physically, because he was just like, I don't really want to have anything to do with you. I don't know. That's kind of how
hearing her side of it. We're only hearing his side of it.
That's true. And he is
presenting.
yeah, and
He killed her.
I don't find Maxim.
He's coming up with an excuse, right? She was
Yeah.
a bitch. I had to kill her.
This is fascinating, Elaine. I can't believe you're taking her side. This is totally rocking me right now because I did not. Okay, we'll keep going. I'll let this play out. It's interesting. Keep going, Christina. I'm sorry.
Yeah, keep going, Christina.
So that's just how I kind of saw it. That like he didn't really want to have anything to do with Rebecca after that point. And they described Danny or Mrs. Danvers described her many partners and stuff. It was all just a game to her. Like they kind of paint her in this picture that's like it's one thing to be promiscuous, like who cares, but it's another to play with people, I guess, was what I was getting. But I don't like Maxim at all. I thought he's a huge gaslighter. He doesn't tell his new bride. I mean, this poor thing. She's so young. She's so naive. He doesn't tell her anything. He's like, yeah, you want to marry me? And she's like, well, I don't want to be with this lady. So yeah, sure, I'll marry you. And he whisks her off to this life and this palace that she just cannot comprehend and is told nothing, is not given any sort of, any help really. And I really feel for her so much. And yeah, I don't like Maxim. I'm gonna end there.
He's super toxic. He really is. He's just, and basically she's his companion now. She just goes from being Mrs. Van Hopper, whatever her name is, who's a nut and who's hilarious, to now she's Maxim's companion. Like he's like, oh, I see that you've gotten some good training. Look, you just come do that here. She's not his wife. She's not his partner.
And the poor thing is left just hoping, and like you said, like his lapdog, like hoping like for a little bit of attention. And he doesn't even say I love you until way at the end. And she's like, that's all I wanted. If you could have just said that like 4 or 5 months ago. And it's like, gosh, how horrible.
The real love in the book is between Mrs. Danvers, the love that she has for Rebecca. And if we're going to, find sympathy for Rebecca, the person that we know Rebecca the most through is Mrs. Danvers. And she's the one who's genuinely mourning Rebecca. Her whole thing, her whole torture of the unnamed narrator comes down to the unsuccessful mourning of Rebecca. And the fact that her death has left this empty spot in her life that she's trying to fulfill. And she's angry. She is the true spouse of Rebecca in so many ways. If you were going to, continue the take it from the queer lens, can we feel sympathy for Mrs. Danvers, who's ready to burn the whole damn thing down in the name of Rebecca? I mean, that's love. That's passion. I will burn this place to the ground because of her. And because of what was done to her. Because she was, Rebecca, like you said, was murdered. Something which is glossed over in the adaptation because of I think the Hays Code or something in the Hitchcock's case. So they just had her, she fell over and hit her head, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think in Hitchcock's case, what I had read was that they felt like the audience would have a hard time rooting for murderers. Right. Like they don't want to see Maxim and new Mrs. De Winter like kind of driving off at the end, and not being thrown in jail. So they had to make it that like accidental death.
Interesting.
And
go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say, just taking these Gothic frameworks, these, De Winter is right out of Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre, who's not, I don't find very sympathetic either. It's these heroines that are the interesting characters. And I just think it's fascinating that we don't even know her name. That drives it, and you don't notice it first. The first time I read Rebecca, it didn't dawn on me. I don't know her name until later somebody pointed out, well, what's her name? Oh my God, we don't know. Why is that? Why would she leave that name an empty space?
Well, I thought that was made sense. In the fact that she's not like a real thing, that nobody treats her like anything other than the second Mrs. De Winter. You know what I mean? So that made sense. It's interesting you said that, Doug, because I did not realize I didn't know her name either. There were times when I was reading it and I was like, oh, maybe I should go back and look. I'm sure they must have said it. Or I actually did that. But when I read I read a synopsis of the movie, and they kept talking about the second Mrs. De Windsor, and they mentioned that we don't know her name, and I'm like, oh, so I'm with you. Like when I read it didn't matter to me, when I read it when I read it, I didn't notice. This is really an interest. This is not the way I thought this conversation was going to go. You guys have surprised me in a way.
Where did you
really
think it was going to go, Tim? Where did you think we were going to go?
No, because I did not read it like this at all. Like y'all, your perspectives are so fascinating to me because for whatever reason, I'm sitting here aware. Like I just gave Maximo a pass. I'm like, he is so damaged and grieving, and he's been like, to me, the setup for him of like the family name and keeping this place going. Like I had a lot of sympathy for him.
Now hold on. Is he grieving or is he just feeling guilty?
Well, clearly you find out later that he's not really grieving, but I felt like the setup for him was just the same as for her. Like I had a lot of sympathy for how burdened and constrained his life was, and the fact that he would marry this woman and then shortly after find out that she's this horrible conniving bitch, in my opinion, and then like he's like, the family name would not allow him to course correct at all. So I felt like he was a victim of her conniving. The other thing's interesting, Elaine, about what you said is that I was starting to feel a lot of sympathy for Mrs. Danvers as the story goes on when she's grieving, and clearly she's so hurt by what happened and grieving, all that thing. But then the moment came when she's giving the narrator the tour of the room, right? The West Wing room, whatever. And that's where everything turned for me, because she starts describing lovingly how conniving and like Christine was saying, the games she played with the men. She talks about in the book, she talks very blatantly about, she can have whatever sex she wants and she can do whatever she wants. And no man can hold her down. Clearly she's madly in love with this woman, but I thought that Rebecca became just a horrible, horrible person through that description lovingly offered by Mrs. Danvers. You know what I mean? Like, isn't that an interesting juxtaposition?
Unless you see it as Rebecca and Mrs. Danvers both knew that Rebecca wasn't that into these men. Like, men are just stupid and men are easy to toy with, and it's a fun little game. I guess I'm still, you're the one who had us do Haunting Hill House, where I said that Shirley Jackson is famous for having two women, right? She always has like the conventional woman and then the non-unconventional. And I guess I'm sort of reading Rebecca the same way. The second Mrs. Danvers is the good conventional woman, the woman that, we are trained to be, to keep sweet, keep quiet, be what your husband wants you to be completely malleable, have no identity going in, have no wants or desires beyond what he wants. And the first Rebecca couldn't do that.
Okay.
For whatever reason, maybe she was gay, maybe she was whatever, we don't know. There might have been something, but there's something there that she could not just submit to stupid Maxim. And that was,
You're so sympathetic toward her. This is fascinating. I'm really loving this. Doug, your eyebrows went up when she said that.
Well, I was just thinking there's something biblical here, because if you go back to, Judaic folklore, Adam had a wife before Eve, Lilith, who was not, pliable, was not, somebody he can mold and get to cooperate with him. And she was sexually, she acted on her own desires. So Adam divorced Lilith. She gets thrown out of Eden.
She becomes the first vampire.
Becomes the first vampire. I'm thinking there's something, Manderley is like Eden in a way. And, DeWinter's gone back and gotten a new wife, one that he could, he can mold. As I think Elaine's spot on about this. He can mold her, and at the end, that you can't vanquish those old ghosts. I think it's props to Elaine again for describing this as a ghost story where you don't really have a ghost. She's totally haunting that place, and her true love is the person who truly loves her, that is going to burn the place down at the end. Eden must burn because it can't have Rebecca in it.
I actually, when I was reading it, this was the second time I read through it. It was so different from the first time, like what you guys were saying, like how you didn't even realize that the protagonist didn't have a name. I had the same experience my first read through, and that was a while ago. But I had a different take on Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca's relationship. I saw it as a very toxic mother-daughter dynamic, because so many of the descriptions were Mrs. Danvers describing Rebecca growing up and how she would brush her hair and how she saw, her riding horses with her cousin, and just like almost like a lifetime of watching this beautiful girl grow up into this very manipulating woman. And I saw it kind of as like a very toxic mother who is latching onto this daughter that they see in the most like she can do no wrong and she's perfect in every single way. And now suddenly you bring in the new Mrs. De Winters and she is not Rebecca. And even if she was beautiful, I don't think it would even have mattered, because Mrs. Danvers holds Rebecca in such a high esteem that like almost godlike. And I don't know. It's almost like a new stepdaughter walking in, and you just know she's doomed from the start. Like there's no way she's going to win Mrs. Danvers' affections in any way. So that I don't know. That's kind of how I personally like felt their connection and their relationship, and I don't know.
So are you seeing then Rebecca as the villain of the story, or Danvers or Maxim? Like, because it almost sounds like you're saying it really wasn't Rebecca then, it was more Mrs. Danvers kind of like going off, like something broke in her and she kind of went off.
I think that there are three villains in the story. I think that obviously Rebecca was not a nice person and she's manipulating, but I don't necessarily agree that her ending should have been what it was. I don't know. But then again, one can make the argument that that's what she wanted her ending to be, that she manipulated Maxim into shooting her because of her diagnosis and she didn't want to go out that way. So it's kind of wrong of her to put that on Maxim. Like, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because at the same time, he's tricked into killing her, but he did do it, I mean, he had the say, he could have walked away or something, but he didn't. And Mrs. Danvers she's batshit crazy. And so I can never forgive her for the way she treated the protagonist, especially that whole scene of where she's like, you want to jump, don't you? Like they're looking out this window and she's like, just do it, And this poor girl is like, she's thinking about it. She's considering it, because she's just at her end and she's not sure what to believe or what to think anymore. So I kind of see them all against the protagonist, who is just along for this ride, and it's not a fun ride.
Maybe it's not just a ghost.
Yeah. Go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say, maybe it's not just a ghost story, but just kind of, your comment about Lilith being a vampire. It's also a vampire story without an actual vampire.
Or an energy vampire.
Yeah, like, because certainly, De Winters he's a husk. He's had this experience of Rebecca's death that's just sucked the life out of him, whether through guilt or actual remorse, who knows? But Mrs. Danvers is kind of the vampire's familiar in a way. And keeping the vampire there so she can continue to suck the life out of everybody in that house.
Well, I do have to say that to me was the supremely creepy moment, was when I mentioned it already, but when she's doing the tour of the room, right? And everything, she moves the brush right back where it's supposed to be. And especially to me, when she opens up the underwear drawer, like I was just like, I mean, seriously, I was like, oh my, this is not happening. Oh, do you want to feel it? And it's all, I mean, that was so creepy to me. I understand all the things you guys are saying. But like that was where I was like, oh, I actually had to take a break in the middle of the book. I don't know if I told you guys that. But like this was very intense to me. Like I was so in it. Like she sucked me in completely. And I think it was after the debacle of the ball dress, which of course we have to discuss that briefly, but we know something's up, this something's not going to go right, but the way it played out, I did not expect what it was that was wrong to be what it was. Like that to me was a huge surprise. And just I was just devastated right along with her, because the way she's trying so hard. Anyway, that was incredible.
She's trying to, in the end, trying to fit in somebody else's skin. And that moment is, you're right. That is a devastating moment. You could just, in terms of the writing, that is one.
Because we're so in her head, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
That's what I loved about it, was like, we are so in her thoughts. Oh, I hope they like it. And I'm so excited, and she and her maid are so excited. I can't wait. And then, when it all just turns, that was amazing. I literally think I had to like stop reading for a few days. So I was really like walking around the house, like affected by this book. And like, that's my hats off to the writing, that was, it had me.
Yeah, I think that was like one of the most upsetting scenes for me in the entire book. I know it's worse when Danvers is trying to get her to jump, and I know it's worse when we find out about Max being murdered. But like you said, Tim, it was because she's finally so excited about something. The entire narrative up until that point is just her being anxious and timid and afraid and uncertain. And finally she has this little moment of like, oh, I'm going to dress up and I've got the perfect costume. And as a reader, even before what happens, you're like, oh, no, wait.
Something's right.
It's like, she's heading into disaster. It's like you're just watching this train wreck.
But what is it going to be? Like, anyway, yeah, it was...
But what makes it worse, too, is that it's the one instance where she actually had a say about something. Because everything in the house, from what she eats to her routine, everything is already decided for her. It's like, oh, well, Mrs. De Winter used to do it like this. And she's like, all right, fine, I'll do it that way, too. This is the one time she got to make a decision about something and was completely manipulated and just... it was horrible.
Or was she taught a lesson? Is that a moral? You don't get a choice. This is your life, and you have to fit this blueprint. And you have to dress for... I would hate to live in a world where I have to dress for dinner and can't come to dinner in my pajamas. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you have to dress for dinner, and you have to receive guests here, and you have to write your letters here, and you have to use this kind of stationery. And, or we're going to teach you, if you try to veer from the path, Little Red Riding Hood, stay right there. Do what you're supposed to do and be a good girl. She had that. But obviously, Mrs. Danvers led her to that costume, and made her do that. But still, it's
because that's the best moment is this horrible thing happens and she goes running off to her room, and then she turns and there's Mrs. Danvers triumphant in the shadows or whatever. And I was just devastated. It was so... I just got to tell you, I was like, this book was so well written. You know what I mean? Like the devices she used to pull me through it, I just was so impressed. I mean, really, are all of her books this good?
Yes.
It's because I've got to read more.
Jamaica Inn is a great read too. It's got a little, the narrative is a little more traditional in terms of its structure, but I think that's, to me, I know a lot of people disagree, but I find that almost as good as Rebecca. I really enjoyed Jamaica Inn. And of course there's Don't Look Now, the novella that's the basis of the film with Donald Sutherland, which is just a fantastic story with some really wicked humor in it. I read My Cousin Rachel. Cousin Rachel didn't make as much an impression on me. What about everybody else? Anybody read any of those or think of others?
I can't think of any others. I did read Jamaica Inn and enjoyed it.
She wrote The Birds, right?
Yeah,
The Birds. Yeah, The Birds.
Yeah,
That's right.
The Birds. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was going to say, when she wrote Rebecca and Hitchcock adapted it, I think the book had only been out a couple of years. It was like a new book. And I think he made Jamaica Inn based on her book before that. And then, of course, he made The Birds. He really had a thing for Du Maurier.
I mean, I can
Mhm.
see why. I mean, I can
Yeah.
see any filmmaker. I can see Hitchcock reading this and going, "Oh man, this is like it's so juicy." You know what I mean? And the fact that it had that big flip in the middle, which just told me because I thought what as I was reading the first half of the book, I thought it's so genius that the title of the book is Rebecca because she's all consuming, you know, like she's everywhere. She couldn't take a breath without it being about Rebecca. She finds the man, you know, the handkerchief with her initial and her little R is everywhere. Like, so it was so like suffocating, you know, and I thought this book is about Rebecca. And then when they do the flip, I thought it was just as genius because, you know, all of a sudden it's still about Rebecca, but everything you thought you knew, you know, it's one of those you have to go back. I just thought that whole setup of all of that was just genius.
And what's really interesting is that it's written in first person, but how much do we really know about the protagonist and her backstory and her life? Like, we barely know that she likes sketching, and eventually that gets smaller and smaller. It's the one thing that we know about her and she likes to do, and it kind of just fades off.
Well, but
Um,
just the point, like she's not really a thing.
right.
Like she has no agency. She has, yeah. This so interesting. By the way, I also wanted to mention. Oh, Brad. I mean, Doug. You have something? Sorry.
I was just going to ask you all, how do you feel about the way Max de Winters gets off at the end? That he basically doesn't have to answer for what he did. Or does that do you all did that make you feel like, oh, thank God he's going to get away with it? Or is there a part of you that really wanted him to have to face up for that? Where are you all on that? Because I'm conflicted. I mean, I kind of, there was something satisfying. I'm like, oh, all right, good. But then I don't know. Is that the right way to feel?
I'm
One
not
thing
a
I
Max fan. I don't care for him. I think he's toxic. I sort of read it as a statement about the power of class and money and, having that power that the De Winters have in society that, like, yeah, he's never going to be held accountable. He could have shot Rebecca, like, in front of people and they would have been, I mean, the constable was like having dinner with them,
Yeah.
right? The lawyers having dinner with them, oh yeah, we'll see you on the squash courts. Like, I think it was just that kind of an attitude of like, well, Max is one of us, so we'll just.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to that, that like it kind of rubbed me the wrong way when the whole, the ship crashes and everything starts to unfold little by little. And the people who are doing the investigations, whenever they talk about Maxim, it's almost like, but we know you could, like, don't worry about it. Like, you're such an upstanding individual in the community. Like, we'll figure something out. This can't be the way it goes. And immediately that rubbed me the wrong way because it's like, well, due process. I don't like, but you're right. It's about status and money, and he's from Mandalay, and it's just, so it would have had to take in a lot of evidence, like, in your face. And I don't know. I don't think the book was set up for him to ever, like, for justice to ever actually occur.
And I'm no authority on Du Maurier. I don't know a lot about her life other than just little bits, but didn't she come from money? Wasn't she kind of in that level of class in her own life? It's kind of an
Mhm.
interesting indictment of
And
that.
she married into, like, her husband was some big general, some big military person. So she had to also play the military wife game of fitting in to that scene and being what they expect the military wife to be, so there is some sort of, like, connection
She
there.
didn't fit in. She herself was not hetero for one thing, at
Right.
least what I recall. And the Venice, I think there was a code for going to Venice was always something about an adventure she was on to, be with other women. It's from what I understand. It's
Hmm.
just interesting
Interesting.
how she didn't, she didn't fit into that box, you know.
That would inform the way this story seems to be told and the points it's making. For what it's worth, I guess I was totally manipulated by it or something, but I like was all for Maxim, and I thought Rebecca was just a total horrible villain the whole time. So I was like, well, of course she had it coming, you know, the way she treated him. And so I was rooting for, I got sucked into the, oh gosh, is he gonna be okay? Like I was rooting for the narrator and Maxim through the end. I wanted it to end with them being, because I thought she was so horrible, you know. To me, the fact that she was having these affairs in his face, and I did not read it as, I read it as her, you know, being very promiscuous with every guy she wanted to, and she, you know, damn him and whatever he might thought, she knew he couldn't do anything. So that's the way I read it. All of these perspectives you guys are sharing are very interesting. It makes me want to go back and reread it all again right now, which I might do at some point. But anyway, I was very sympathetic to Maxim and the protagonist for sure.
What's interesting is the ending is not really a happy ending, even though Mrs. Danvers is vanquished. I mean, Max is pretty much an invalid, you know, and now the narrator's gonna have to take care of him. It's really a bleak ending. It's not a romantic ending for a Gothic romance. It sure doesn't have that ending, kind of like, you know, Jane Eyre and Rochester, they get to be together, you know.
Yeah.
Or am I misreading? Does anybody see it as a happy ending?
No, I'm wondering if the intention was for it to be a romance. I'm wondering if that was her intention or not, because I have a hard time. I get the romantic aspects of it, and especially in terms of Gothic romance, but I find it difficult to read. But no, you're right. I mean, he is sort of that Mr. Rochester, very condescending. I was just going to say their relationship is just so uncomfortable for me, Maxim and the new Mrs. De Winter, because he just treats her like she's a pet, like she's a toy. And you know, and so I'm like, is that romance? If anything, I've been doing it wrong.
It's kind of a rewriting in a way of Jane Eyre, you know, in a way, and sort of in some ways. And when I say Gothic romance, I mean in terms of genre, you know, it's that, but it's in some ways it's sort of a revision of Jane Eyre with the bleaker ending and making us confront just really the inadequacy of somebody like Max de Winters, that in ways that we're not exactly invited to really think about in depth about Rochester, at least that I remember. It's been a long time since I read Jane Eyre.
And I think too, like the second Mrs. De Winter, she just wanted it to work out so much. You know, she put her everything into this relationship. And I think it's more of the writer looking into like human nature and the complexities within each of the characters, because they're all very complex. So I agree with you guys. I don't think it's necessarily like straight up, you know, a romantic story that should have a happy romantic ending. I think the second Mrs. De Winters wanted it to be a happy romantic ending. But is that necessarily a good thing? I don't know. Like, is she going to be happy after, you know, the whole Rebecca thing is done? I don't know. Because sometimes what you really want is not what's best for you as well. And she went into the relationship very naive, very young. He literally would call her child. And I don't know, maybe that's the way they spoke back in the day. But there's definitely a strange dynamic between the two of them.
Right. And I'm not sure she knew what she wanted. I think she was so, you know, she was kind of groomed into this relationship so that I think she might be, her biggest relief was that he hated Rebecca. Her whole fear was like, oh my God, he's still in love with Rebecca and I can never match up. I'll never be her. And then he's like, well, I shot her. And she was like, yes, good. You know, you hated her. That's awesome. So like now being his helper, his caregiver, that might be a happy ending for her. Like that, like, I don't think she knows what she wants. So that might, now that she's his whole world, like, okay, this is great.
Yeah, that was really interesting too. When I read that, it was like, do you not hear what he's telling you? But But all she could think is, oh my God, he doesn't love her. And it's all about me now, which is what I wanted. It's very skewed.
Well, to see, I didn't see again. Gosh, I just thought I was so rooting for her that I was happy. I thought that was a great happy twist because she was like it was so oppressive. She could never live up to Rebecca. Everything was about Rebecca. Everybody talked about Rebecca all the time. Everything was compared. I found that so oppressive that I was right there with her, quite honestly. And when she flipped it and she's like, he can now love me because I realized, she had it all wrong. I actually found that to be happy news too, because I was like so over Rebecca and everybody, you know what I mean? Like I kind of totally got that. I was like, oh yeah. It's the first time she could passionately kiss him, if you remember, as soon as that news was out, because suddenly she was freed from the oppression, that burden of the Rebecca on everything. Suddenly that went away and she was like freed. And I actually found that. So I think that's why I was rooting for them, because I was rooting for her. She suddenly had this freedom to let that all go. Suddenly she can talk back to Mrs. Danvers a little bit, have a little bit of agency. So I was, from that point, sort of rooting for them to somehow make it. The twist at the end with the fire, of course, sort of makes me feel like they sort of got what they really had coming to them. And that was sort of satisfying in its own dark way. But I was sort of rooting for him not to go to jail and for them to have for her to finally kind of have the life she wanted now that Rebecca was finally vanquished, And then I feel like there was the wink at the end of, well, no, it's not really going to be as happy ending as, But anyway, that's the way I read it.
I think that's how Hitchcock read it too, because there's in the film, when they finally find out that Rebecca's, he was involved in Rebecca's death, not that he actually murdered her, but that he was involved and didn't really love her. That's finally when I just remember this scene, because I remember it being like, oh yeah, she finally says, I'm Mrs. De Winter, when someone, is like trying to call her a different name. Like she finally takes the identity, like that's me, not right. Her. She's
very
gone.
Satisfying. Yeah. The only other thing I wanted to mention that we haven't discussed, and I know we probably should have said this eons ago in the conversation, but there was another moment. There were several moments that were like really stuck with me, right? And the first one that I thought really set everything up, because I talked about how I felt like she set the characters up so well. We knew exactly who they were, is when she first arrives at Mandalay and Max was like, I told them not to make a fuss, whatever. And they're like wet from the rain and she's looking horrible and she doesn't know what she's doing. And they walk in and the whole staff is lined up. And that to me was such a moment, especially when I'm reading it.
That was Mrs. Danvers doing. That was her first, that, welcome to Mandalay. Welcome to Mrs. Danvers. This is what she's like.
Oh yeah, I mean, she set that up, and I told Mrs. Danvers I didn't want this, but that was the first dig, and that's when I was really like this is gonna be, this is, you know what I mean? That was just, to me, that was the perfect plot point to put right there, because we wanted her, I wanted so desperately for her to make it in and be okay and be accepted, and then you're like, oh. This is how this is gonna go. You know what I mean? That's when I she really told me exactly what this book really was. And then that's why I said the setup from that moment where she's standing there drenched in front of everybody, embarrassed and mortified, right? And with powerless completely. That to me was where the setup was I could not wait to read the next sentence.
So I thought too, them driving through the rain to get to the house, I was like, oh, that's a bad omen right there. I know it's not their wedding day, but that's not how you want to start things.
But Max is so jolly about it, if I remember. Oh, this is, how fun. Here we are. No big deal. And then they walk in. Anyway, I just thought that was brilliant writing.
I don't think Max can see it from her perspective. I think that's why he's so jolly about it. He's comfortable at Mandalay. That's his kingdom.
Yeah.
He can't step back and say, oh, wait, my new bride, who's from a completely different social class, has never stepped foot here before, might be feeling like a fish out of water. That doesn't even occur to him.
No. Yeah. I mean, that was the setup, right? But it was so weird though that now that Elaine, you're making these points so strongly, and like I really gave him a lot of passes. You know what I mean? Like I was just like, oh, he's just used to this and he doesn't think about it. You know, like I knew, like I thought, kept thinking, golly, he really probably should have told her if you think, but like it's so weird. Like when I guess I'm going to read it again, but when I read it, I was just kind of like, oh well, you know, he's just one of those clueless, wealthy guys, and he's anyway. Yeah, I gave him a lot of passes. It's interesting.
So what should Tim read next? Since we're giving Tim on this reading.
Well, my plan is to do the We All Lived in the Castle.
Oh yeah.
I love that one.
Because you all talked about how much you love it, and I loved the first one. But I mean, I have a bunch of books in order, so I'm not sure exactly when but that is the next one I plan to read. Unless somebody thinks I should veer somewhere else, I'm happy for suggestions. I wrote down all the things you've mentioned so far, by the way. And I do want to read another one of du Maurier, so I might do Jamaica Inn next if you were suggesting it.
I'd be happy if you did We Always Lived in the Castle next.
That is definitely that is definitely the next major horror novel I plan to do. So,
you know, a fun one eventually might be Rosemary's Baby, which really kind of, you know, considering these women who've been gaslighted, would be an interesting, you know, novel to look at.
That's a good one, Doug.
And Come Closer by Sarah Gran would be fun too. That's a more contemporary one.
There's so many good ones.
Yeah, so much to read.
Well, I have to tell you guys, I've so appreciated how kind you've been to me, guiding me through all this, and I'm like really new to this genre, so it's been so exciting. You know, like I don't know, like both of these books to me were just total home runs. You know, like I did not expect. I mean, like Rebecca was, I was like I told you, I was in it. I had to take a break, and I kept talking about it. And of course, Steve, my husband, made me mad the whole time. Oh, how's Becky? He called me Becky the whole time. He even did it today. Oh, you're having your conversation about Becky. I'm like, not. It would never have been Becky.
He does not want to be called Becky.
No.
You're the last person in the whole world that you would ever think of calling. Anyway, so that's of course why he did it. But anyway, but I want to thank you guys. I've so enjoyed these conversations, and I'm really excited about all this sort of new world that I'm reading. So anyway, I've just really, really enjoyed it.
Well, it's enjoyable. Like I said, going back and rereading these things now, I'm seeing them differently and sort of, you know, getting a new spin on them. So I've thoroughly been enjoying this as well.
Yeah, and it's really fun, like hearing everybody's different perspectives, because, you know, like when you read it, it's all in your own head and your own, you know, thoughts, but it's a lot of fun to hear what everyone else has to say about it.
Absolutely. Same here. I enjoy
Well, actually, yeah, what's interesting is all the points you guys made from your different perspective. Like I can totally see it. It's like nobody's said anything where I'm like I can totally see how you could read it all those different ways. And what's interesting for me is I'm sitting here thinking, you know, like what does this say about me that I read it the way I did? You know, like there's a little self-reflection going on. You know, like I said, I gave Maxim all these passes, and you know, anyway. It's interesting. Gives me something to think about. But I've really enjoyed hearing all the different points of view about all of this. And I guess I do want to read We All Live in the Castle. So if you guys are interested in doing one more at least of these conversations, whenever that happens, I would love to do that because this is super fun.
My last comment though about Rebecca was they kept describing like the layout of the food and like, you know, they were having this and that. And I thought, oh, that's almost like when we go to Phantom History House and there's a buffet of sweets and bakeries, you know, it's like walking into something so sumptuous. Yeah, it made me think of that.
Well, that's a lovely compliment. Wow. I hardly think we're up to Mandalay standards, but I have something to attempt to try to do now. No, that's very kind of you to even have that association at all. I did love how she talked about who would eat all this food. You know what I mean? Like, what about the waste? But I could never say anything like that. You know, like all of that. I just loved all of that in her head stuff. I really did. Okay, I got to stop talking about it over and over, but super fun. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doug,
This
Christina,
was so
Elaine, you
much
guys have been
fun.
so much fun. Thank you for having this conversation with me today. It was really, really great.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.